Good evening and welcome. This following PowerPoint presentation is narrated to you by myself, Lisa Dole, and the entirety of the program is put together by myself, Karen Moore, and Kelly Ward. Though the presentation itself is titled Sexual Assault, we will go into detail about also sexual abuse, rape, sexual assault, of course, and sexual harassment. Now you notice on here that we have a definition of what is sexual assault. And I'm not going to read this verbatim, but I think the biggest thing that comes to mind when we hear about sexual assault nowadays is obviously the Me Too movement that we are hearing so much about. And another thing that many of us can appreciate is that sexual assault is also very commonly known now as sexual violence. And though I did mention we were going to talk about rape, rape does fall under this umbrella with sexual assault. This includes things such as unwanted touching or unwanted kissing, rubbing, groping, and any kind of act that is done forcefully. You'll see the definition here of what is sexual abuse. When I personally think of sexual abuse, what most commonly comes to mind is the mistreatment of children. And for those of you that follow the news, and even if you don't really follow the news, one of the biggest stories that hit recently that really describes this quite well is Larry Nassar's and the gymnasts that were taken and just brutally taken advantage of there. We look at types of sexual assault, and we can see on the screen it gives us different definitions here. I mentioned before about the Me Too movement and that sexual violence, how this includes rape and the unwanted of touching and kissing and whatnot. Rape and sexual assault are being used interchangeably when we cover these events that led up obviously to this Me Too movement. And though unintentional, I think many people get confused when they talk about is this sexual assault, is this rape, is one not the other, but one falls under that umbrella once again. We start talking about sexual assault in society, and I think the best way to put this is that historically social attitudes towards, for lack of a better term, hostile actions have assumed this continuum of severity. So we've got these types of sexual assault and how society responds to it. And whether it's insults that are offensive or verbal sexual overtures, and how one may not be as bad as another one. And you can have somebody that thinks perhaps, well, maybe there's no penetration, so it wasn't that bad. So then we start looking at, how one person's view of how something happened kind of skews things, and how they perceive it kind of rubs off on another person and another person, and that in turn just makes society just say, really? I don't think it's that bad. So this part of the PowerPoint is going to go into physical and behavioral signs of a sexual abused person. I'm not going to go through the list. But when we're talking about this, a lot of times, majority of times, we're talking about children again. When we look at child sexual abuse, we need to remember that sexual activity involving a child in the context of an abusive situation is in all 50 states illegal, because we need to remember that children simply cannot consent to sex. So if you are to see any of these signs, you do not need to engage in interviewing. You simply need to pick up the phone and call 1-800-25-ABUSE. That brings me into talking about the prevalence of child sexual abuse. Some statistics are 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 6 boys, and 1/4 of all sexually abused children will be abused more than once. So we're looking at social problems that are related to a history of sexual assault or abuse. And I don't want to say history, and we assume now that we're talking about a child that's been abused or assaulted over a huge length of time, because that certainly doesn't need to be the case. What we're insinuating here, or trying to imply here, that we have risk factors in children's responses to sexual abuses. And I think that's what we're trying to have this segue here. And you'll see on the PowerPoint what it goes into. And a little bit more that we wanted to go into were the risk factors that were not on here, that we talk about, that we didn't need to talk about, but we have social class and ethnicity appear to be unrelated. And a lot of times I think that is something that is a misconception. People seem to think that that might be, but that's completely unrelated. Girls involved in the criminal justice system have a high prevalence of sexual abuse. That's a risk factor. Presence of a stepfather in the home increases the risk. And children with a disability are at an increased risk. Before we look at a specific intervention with these children or adults or whoever it is that's been through this trauma, we need to look at the actual victim's need. We need to be sure that they're safe, and that's the first and foremost that we're going to do, is make sure they are safe, whether the predator is removed from the home or they are removed from the home, to make them safe. And these are just a couple bullet points that we wanted to make here about that. This clip shows a little bit of what it would like be for a child to come to a center. Again, this is Lisa. I did my internship with Guardian Angel, and I did this in twofold. The first part of my internship was doing direct servicing with advocacy. So I went out on rape calls to 6 hospitals. And then the second part was very much like this lady that you'll see in this video. And I children from age 3 till age 18. This slide says a lot: help, hope, healing. This very same frame used to hang on the wall there. And I think it says a lot because there is a certain amount of response that these children have in sexual abuse, that clients have in sexual abuse, that do help them, that do hope, and that are part of the healing process. Disclosure is very individual. Some simply never disclose, and that is just very much on the individual person. Some disclosures they're partial, or actually some of them are accidental, and they come in pieces, and you have to piece them together. Adolescents disclose as very much, it's like they're testing their independence. I worked with 2, and I learned quite a bit from the way they had their statements come out. And the last client that I worked with in particular, I found that their disclosures actually came from an event that triggered it. The emphasis on this screen is about treatments for sexual abuse. But again, we need to concentrate on the fact that each individual heals and continues to make these goals at their own individual pace. It should also be explored that there are age-specific interventions, especially when we are working with children. And from the age of, I'll say, 1 to 10 and ages 11 to 18, those are two separate groups that have two very age-specific interventions. You would not, a kid that is, say, 5 or 8, you're always going to re-emphasize the fact that you want that child to know that what has happened is not their fault. And you're going to also coincide this with the parent or the caretaker so that they understand the importance of their response to their child. You have got to reassure this child that they are believed, because the child many times thinks they're bad, or I've even had a child think that they were crazy. Praising them for being able to be strong and so brave to tell, and acknowledging any of their feelings, no matter how off the chart it might be, or whether you may think it's not relevant, it is relevant to what you're talking to them about. You may very well work with a child that exhibits inappropriate sexual behavior when you're talking to them, and that needs to be redirected without any panic. There needs to be teaching or reteaching at this point, and they need to know that it's okay, that they can still enjoy life and become okay with their body, even though parts of their body have been abused, and physically so. In the other slide, we talked a bit about treatments for sexual abuse and some interventions specifically for the younger children. I gave an example of children that were under the age of 10. And here we're looking at cognitive behavioral therapy, as this has been studied and research has been, just endless amount of research has been done saying that this is the way to go. And I want to reiterate again how the age in between, how and what you work with as far as an age-specific intervention for a younger child and how you work with an older child is going to be different. It may very well start off reminding them about that abuse and it not being their fault. But where you come into an older child, in let's say their teenage years, you're going to start looking at having to address issues of homosexuality as they arise, and even providing that information about sex and sexuality with these teenagers. They may also need to process these feelings that have overcome them with blame and guilt as well, as they don't understand and are just unable to express these feelings. And this is where CBT comes in. Talking a little bit more about this slide and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, or TFCBT, and exactly what it is. First of all, it's an evidence-based treatment, and this has been shown to help children, adolescents, and their parents as well, how to take these hurdles of trauma and overcome them. TFCBT is designed to kind of counteract both the negative emotional and the behavioral responses that come with, and how we're talking about here, sexual abuse and sexual assault, but it also attacks other things, and it's a great intervention for DV and loss and just any kind of traumatic event. The treatment itself is based on both learning and cognitive theories, and what it does is it looks at addressing the distorted beliefs and attributes things related specifically to the abuse, while providing this environment that's supportive so these children can talk about the trauma that has occurred. So whether that is the safe environment with a sand table or group or music therapy, but it's all within this environment so that they're able to better talk. Trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy also helps these caretakers and parents who perhaps were not the ones that abused to cope effectively. CBT or trauma-focused CBT can also work in the form of a group therapy as well. There's research to back this up as well. Changes, or goals rather, that a client might work towards, that a counselor or social worker might aim with, is in particular the way that the child is acting, or specifically the way the child is feeling, the way they think, like how they are learning how to problem solve, or just their self-esteem just being in the tank. These are different ways that they can work with these attitudes and goals in group. Joint or family therapy is a super therapy for where we're looking for the unit or family to move forward with change. As they reunify sometimes, or just trying to move forward and working together as this unit, we see this family being able to have this therapeutic intervention together. With the support network of a family, you're looking at reducing guilt on the victim and fear with the caregiver. So this is where family therapy is quite productive. The concept that I would say that family therapy works the most on is probably resistance. It provides great communication so that you've got this dialogue that's able to open up with family therapy between caregiver and victim. And moving forward, they're able to experience being involved with each other to get past the trauma and reunification. I do hope that you enjoyed this PowerPoint. A couple points that I want to leave you with that we did not touch in this PowerPoint, but I'm thinking that you might like to have some answers with. And those might be, are there steps to crisis intervention, or are there tools for crisis intervention that might look differently if you're working with an older child or perhaps an adult? And my answer to that, simply because I worked and I did this for my internship, is I would say that there's 6 things to keep in mind. And no matter if you're working with a child or an adult or an elderly person, whether they're a fresh victim or this is an older person that's, had this trauma and there's something that's starting with gaslighting or whatever it might be. And the number one thing to always remember is to always ensure that person's safety. Oh, don't even engage them unless they're in a safe place that they can talk about what it is that they want to talk about it. The second thing is to don't guess about what it is. Paraphrase questions so that they're open-ended for yourself, so that they are telling you and you can better define the problem of what it is that you're going to discuss. It is only then that you can then provide the support and look at the alternatives that are available to that person. You can then move forward with setting goals or making plans, and then, if need be, obtain a commitment. As far as tools for an intervention, I can only say that to have an effective, healthy relationship as a social worker, you're going to need that rapport, you'll need that empathy, that you want to be able to convey honesty and give back counseling that has that caring and warmth, genuineness, and just that unconditional positive regard. and that comes in the form of both verbal and nonverbal communication. And you need to be mindful of that nonverbal communication. Be mindful of your verbal communication when you're in that crisis intervention, and always engage with the ability to clarify your statements and perhaps reflect a little bit in your head by using those critical thinking skills. Again, paraphrasing, like I said, validating your person that you're working with, and again, with using those open-ended questions. So then we come to, well, do we have roadblocks to communication? You might. At one point, I'm sure anybody will. I certainly did. So is there a solution? Do you avoid it? You certainly don't avoid it, but you do walk through it. And you can say things like try to fix your face, don't have facial gestures or anything like that, but say, if I understand you correctly, and come back and make sure that, again, you're validating them because you are listening, but you're asking again for that clarification, because you're always going to center around that client, putting them first. We hope you enjoyed our presentation. Thank you.